Sweet Kentucky Fried Fuck, I have spent literally a whole week talking exclusively about Weezer and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame through multiple videos with multiple people on multiple channels, and don't get me wrong, it's been fun, it's been great, but oh my fucking lord, I am so happy to finally be doing an album review again. It seems we truly have found a death metal oasis in the midst of this harsh, unforgiving desert that we will now call the first 2 weeks of May 2021. My fucking lord, what a dry couple of weeks. Abyss of Wrathful Dieties is the sophomore studio album from English death metal crew Grave Miasma. But don't let that fool you into thinking that this is a brand new band that we're only now discovering, because they've been kicking around in the underground for close to 15 years now. Having formed in 2006, having released a few EPs in 2009 and 2010 respectively, before finally unleashing a debut album in 2013. Now admittedly, they have been slightly less active following the release of this debut album, duh, considering there is an 8-year time gap between this and the debut album, but not entirely absent per se. In fact, they put out a pretty sweet collection of demos just last year. More importantly though, all of this material has been extremely good, and considering that 2021's death metal output has been pretty spectacular, thanks to big releases from Gatecreeper, Frozen Soul, Swamp Beast, Abiotic, and legendary bands like Asphyx and Cannibal Corpse, there's good reason to assume that this Grave Miasma record will be yet another incredibly fantastic, enjoyable slice of brutal underground death metal madness. A very fair assumption to make, mind you, especially following the opening track, Guardians of Death, which packs huge, slimy, murky grooves and lunges forward with the hostility and immediacy that I would expect of Cannibal Corpse or early Obituary. But once you begin to dig a little deeper, it becomes pretty obvious that this is far more than your typical slice of old-school death metal worship. It can at times be a very dark and intense listen, pulling from not just across the death metal spectrum, but from across the extreme metal spectrum. For instance, the band's anonymous lead singer and guitarist, known simply as Y on all Grave Miasma recordings, including this one, shows a keen interest in Middle Eastern and specifically Israeli music, incorporating those ancient scales and a lot of unorthodox instruments and sitars and flutes and gongs and chimes into this very murky, brutal death metal sound. The vocals as well stray heavily from your standard Cookie Monster guttural, almost pulling from the realm of black metal with these very chaotic, agonizing, painful screams. And on top of that, there's a really eerie and chaotic fog that cloaks so much of this record that occasionally makes it feel kind of uncomfortable in its most atmospheric moments. Imagine like Incantation or the chaotic Blackened death of bands like Ulthar and Woad, but filtered through like Deathspell Omega or Colored Sands era Gorguts. Yes, it's still got some pretty pungent old-school death flavor, but it's also a lot more versatile and immersive than your typical record from, say, Necrot or Cannabis Corpse. And while I do feel like the weight of Grave Miasma's own ambitions slightly crush and dull this album, I think ultimately it's probably one of the more interesting underground releases we've heard so far in 2021. You've got a track like Rajiapa, which is more or less an avalanche of chaotic blackened death metal filled to the brim with sick, twisted, churning riffs, all tumbling over each other, creating a very hellish and overwhelming kind of experience. You've also got a track like Ancestral Waters, which aesthetically is a little bit more mystical. We're going into more supernatural kind of terry, and the music reflects that by going into more mid-pace, groove-laden kind of death metal. Peppered in between sections of this song are some really slow-burning riffs as well that I'm just totally in love with. They are caked in blood and misery in the best way possible. You've also got a track like Under the Megalith, which embraces a little bit more of its black metal hellfire and meshes it with some of the sickly grooves we've heard throughout this record, almost resembling some long-lost fusion of classic Morbid Angel and like late 90s, early 2000s Behemoth. All leading up to the album's very powerful closing number, Kingdoms Beyond Kailash, which more or less embodies the spirit of like some really dark, fucked up death doom. The album can be ruinously effective and gripping, but not to the point where it's just true doom and gloom all the way through. There are still lots of meaty, vicious riffs all through this thing, fantastic percussion, fantastic vocals, fantastic performances in general for that matter, and the production does a pretty good job at letting all of this shine in the spotlight when necessary. I will say that at times it can be a little muddy and soupy. Certain parts and certain elements do kind of blur together into one big sludgy mess, but that also weirdly adds to the overall charm of the album in a strange way. I can definitely see this backfiring for some people, but for me it just kind of adds to the murky, hellish chaos that this album so consistently unleashes. What's harder to defend, though, is the album's unnecessarily bloated runtime. A majority of the tracks clock in between 6.5 to 7 minutes long, and quite frankly, they just don't need to. And that can make certain moments on the record come off as being somewhat stale and monotonous, especially on repeat listens. It's a shame because for the most part, Grave Miasma have cooked up a really nice fucking steak here, you know? It's medium rare, nice and pink in the center, the way it should be. It's well seasoned, it looks pretty. Unfortunately, the band just forgot to trim the fucking fat off. Overall, I'd feel comfortable giving this a pretty hearty 3.5 out of 5. Whatever issues we may have with the soupy production and the unnecessarily fatty runtime, really doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things so long as Grave Miasma deliver big riffs, nasty solos, and crazy, hectic, chaotic, death metal, extreme metal madness, which is exactly what they have done despite everything else on this album. It remains pretty consistently an entertaining and engaging record even on repeat listens. This is the kind of thing I'm sure the death metal fanboys and nerds will go absolutely gaga over. It sits pretty firmly in between the things that define both old school and modern death metal, which means all around it should be weirdly a somewhat accessible album by death metal standards, which I think is pretty cool. And while obviously not a full-blown avant-garde or progressive death metal album, its avant-garde and progressive ideas and influences should do enough to entice those of you who are looking for something a touch more substantial from your usual death metal brew. So, Abyss of Wrathful Deities, 3.5 out of 5. It could have been great, it's damn near close, but hey, who's gonna argue with good? There's still plenty of great ideas and still plenty of great riffs for you to sink your fucking teeth into, and ultimately that's what matters. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.